Welcome to the Short Funk Podcast. I'm Tom Barbalet, and today I'm not going to read from written documentation. I'm going to make this promise here associated with a specific topic. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about my childhood and talk a little bit about my return to Australia periodically. When I was a boy growing up in Australia, I said this previously in Short Funk, and I'll say it again. The Australian War Memorial was a central point of my childhood existence. It was cool, both figuratively and literally. It was very large, and it gave a sense of human stupidity on an epic scale. As a child growing up, I couldn't imagine circumstances where societies would go to war as they had done historically for decades prior, and I thought humanity had made a turn for the better in the fact that we wouldn't be killing each other in vastly barbaric ways going forward. Sadly, this wasn't the case. The Australian War Memorial changed and started adding sections associated with the conflict in Afghanistan, the conflict in Iraq, and a wide variety of the other conflicts that seemed to exist after my exit from Australia. But something else started to happen. The Australian War Memorial became a bastion of a particular kind of Australian nationalism. Australian nationalism that only focused on the conflicts that Australia was involved in, but also Australian nationalism that was primarily about reducing the amount of historic information that would be given to people in order to keep them in a very particular perspective associated with history. First on the chopping block of this was the Holocaust. The Holocaust for me is probably one of the most important things in history. It eliminated a portion of my family, but it also represented a society that, on a number of levels, was sympathetic to a variety of the ideas that I hold relatively dear, particularly associated with science, associated with emphatic industrial progression, in creating a vision of the future in the near and then developing upon it. There were elements of Nazi Germany that I find fantastic, a place of fantasy, absolutely stunning, in particular associated with engineering and the focus on engineering through the late 1930s and early 1940s. But the German state, as it was created as a fascist state, as an archetypical fascist state, with the integration of politics, industry, and military, created something that ultimately killed millions and millions of people. And it is one of the most curious set of events through history, from my perspective at least, as someone who thinks of themselves as relatively interested in the future and industry's impact on the future, that this state was created with this complex set of contradictions and ultimately nuances that are really important still to understand, particularly as we see ourselves currently. Here I talk about being in the US, but it's relatively applicable to most English-speaking Western democracies. The Australian War Memorial reduced the Holocaust to a cue card that didn't mention any numbers associated with those that died, and didn't mention any causal effects that led towards the Holocaust. It didn't talk about the nature of the state. It didn't talk about the ideology of the state. It just had a small cue card indicating that people had died in camps. Not numbers, just that it had occurred. When I went to the Australian War Memorial in 2009, having been out of Australia for a decade, this hit me strongly. The Australian War Memorial had historically contained a narrative associated with the rise of Nazism, the rise of the SS, and how the Holocaust was allowed to occur. Nothing like this existed anymore. There is a side narrative associated with the War Memorial getting in consultants in the late 90s that told them that their whole structural form, the narrative, the mannequins wearing the uniforms, carrying the guns, was too complicated for a broad audience and that they needed to dumb down their message. I'm not going to delve into that. But the cue card that represents the Holocaust in 2009 was something that I took away and thought to myself, how does one react to this? Returning in 2015, I put $40 into the donation box as I entered the War Memorial. I believe very strongly that national museums devoted to war are very important in terms of a new generation understanding why these things should not be there. Not for a justification for the current total wars, not for a justification of the previous total wars, not for a justification of nationalism, the importance of invading other countries, the importance of nuking other countries, the importance of us versus them, and the right of us to do what we like to them. My perspective is it's about a folly of human understanding. It's about actually a memorial to human stupidity, not anything else. But when I walked past the cue card that referred to the Holocaust and pointed out to my brother, who had walked past it and not even noticed it, that he had passed the only documentation of the Holocaust in the Australian War Memorial, I decided to write to the Australian War Memorial and outline how their lack of historical context, and by not describing the number of folks who were killed in the Holocaust, placated Holocaust deniers and ultimately damaged the next generation of Australians. I've gotten one email response saying I might get a response associated with that. And as this fell a month to the day of the recording of this podcast, I decided to email them again, just saying, perhaps you could add the number of people that were killed, and perhaps you could add the context. That's what I'm asking for here. I don't think it's a big ask. You could add a couple more lines to the cue card. I didn't make that last point. But I think it's important for individuals within these kind of environments to do these kind of things and make these kind of emphatic pleas. At the end of the day, the Australian War Memorial will probably continue to dumb down the information that they present. I doubt there's going to be any change associated with the way that they show the Holocaust. However, as an individual, I am now donating to charities that document the Holocaust, that take written documentation in Yiddish, and translate it to English, and put it on the internet to describe what it is like to live in a small village in Poland or Lithuania, to see the SS marching in, to see what they do in your community, and ultimately what happens when you're on the wrong end of fascism. Tom Barbalet in San Jose, signing out.